Hi, it's Dr. Bob Weathers here again, talking with Christine McCulka, my partner here. And today I want to talk about why not just say no. Okay. Before I dive into the content, I want to talk about, in the spirit of earlier videos, I want to talk about particularly how we learn by becoming active mentors. And I suggested before that when we learn something new, say from a book, something that we've read, to plan on sharing it, to be intentional about teaching someone else what we've learned. And I just use as a benchmark within a 48-hour period so that we keep ourselves kind of on track with what we've learned. And what that does is it forces us to share what we've learned by heart, because you can't turn back to the book and read book, chapter, and verse. You have to share what you know from inside. And I got to thinking about this, is that to share with somebody else what you've learned this way, it requires, first of all, it requires some reflection on within myself. It also requires being spontaneous, because you don't know exactly how it's going to come out. And I was thinking about how those two qualities, self-reflection and spontaneity, oftentimes aren't characteristic of a conventional classroom setting. So in that spirit, here goes. I've been reading about recent neuropsychological research going on in addiction, specifically around alcohol abuse, but related to drug addiction as well. And one of the pieces that's really gotten the focus in the last 10 years is trying to figure out what's going on inside the brain where those that are addicted will continue to abuse drugs or alcohol even when they are suffering hugely adverse consequences. In other words, they don't seem to learn that doing behavior A, in terms of drinking or using, is going to lead to consequence B, which can sometimes be catastrophic, such as the loss of a spouse or of one's children. That's not uncommon with more severe addictions. The loss of one's job, and before one loses one's job, the loss of efficiency on a job or effectiveness, and so to suffer really poor job performance, which can lead up to being fired. And also I was thinking about this in terms of a great loss would be the loss of one's integrity. None of us are born on this planet, as far as I know, to see how drunk we can get and stay that way. In other words, that there's a way that we're aborting our fate or our destiny as human beings by being altered chemically. And yet, knowing all of these losses are entailed, that those that are addicted don't stop even with that information. Neuropsychologists are interested in understanding what's going on inside the brain, that this isn't getting learned. There's an interesting focus in the recent years, and it's a mouthful. They've discovered there's a part of the brain called the Cortico-Basal Ganglia network. And I'm going to talk about it just in terms of what I know, is that the cortex, cortico, is connected to the basal ganglia in another part of the brain that are associated with learning and also movement. And the research that I've been reading in the last week or two looks at how it is that particular system, the cortico-basal ganglia network, the network between the cortex and the basal ganglia, that is quite impaired, sometimes permanently, by being bathed in chemicals. There's a feature of the brain called neuroplasticity, that is, that our brains are constantly changing. That's how we learn. And when I started graduate school over 30 years ago, the basic understanding was that the brain stops developing about age 25. And in the last 30 years, that's not only been overturned, but there's been tons of research that suggests that our brains are quite fluid and active, or plastic in this term, neuroplasticity, right up to the day we die. There's no point in our lives where we can't learn new behaviors and unlearn old behaviors. So what the heck is going on inside the brain circuitry of somebody that's addicted and abusing drugs? It appears that the brain is physically damaged, and one of the key sources of that damage is in this network. Hence, the lowered capability of unlearning. And so if I'm addicted to alcohol or drugs, you'd think that just common sense would suggest, by my learning how much I'm losing, that I would be able to change my behavior. It's very difficult to unlearn behaviors when this network is affected, and it's particularly vulnerable to the effects of drugs and alcohol. So that's the data to start with. Now I'm interested in the implication of it. In each one of these presentations, I want to offer what I think of as topics for reflection. This is really where I put my head to my hand and think for a few minutes. And how this came up for me, Christine, in the last week was, have I or have you ever found yourself judging someone who's addicted to drugs or alcohol, and judge them as maybe being weak, or maybe even worse? I certainly have. And insofar as I've done that, I ask myself the question, what impact does this neuropsychological research have then on that attitude? If I'm a counselor, for example, I'm counseling somebody, and I'm inclined to judge them as somehow being defective because they're not getting it. They're not just saying no. Why can't someone just learn to say no? I can imagine as a counselor getting impatient, much less as a family member or a spouse. How does the research I've just mentioned, how does that affect that attitude, is a question I'm asking myself. If someone has brain damage, at least temporarily, acute brain damage, if not chronic, and really is impaired in their ability to unlearn, it's much deeper than just saying no. Okay. Finally, I was thinking of the psychologist Carl Rogers and how the basis of his theory of therapy was utilizing unconditional positive regard. It makes me think that if I have an awareness of the client that I'm counseling suffering from a long-term addiction, probably being impaired in terms of judgment and the ability to reflect on oneself, insight, much less to unlearn old behaviors, what would unconditional positive regard look like as a response? Chances are they're not getting that from anywhere. And in fact, if I respond with judgment, I'm probably repeating what they're already getting elsewhere. And I'm going to ask that of myself and put that out there as a question. What would Carl Rogers' unconditional positive regard look like working with someone who's addicted, particularly in light of the research that suggests that there's impairment? I'm worried about this getting misunderstood. I'm worried about it being, well, let's just go easy on addiction, and it's not about that at all. It's like getting real about what's going on with addiction. And my thought is that until you get the toxins out of the system and get the person really regulated, one psychiatrist I worked with called it getting the person back to their birthday brain, to where they can really reflect on what's going on in their behavior and possibly unlearn it, then it doesn't make sense to push them beyond what they're capable of. You want to get them sober and detoxified as quickly as possible. That's just one implication. Thanks, Christine.